The plenitude of power the bishops of Rome have used continually up to the present, and are now using for the worse. For they are able to exercise this, their wickedness, that is, the subjection of the empire, to themselves, and are able by their so-called pastors and most holy fathers to stir up and nourish the discord already incited. Smitten with cupidity and avarice, with pride and ambition, they are striving either to break up the empire or to transfer it in another form to their own control, lest the excesses which they have committed should be corrected by the power of princes, and they should be subject to well-merited discipline. They are placing obstructions in the way of the prince, on every side, yet craftily hiding their object. They say they are doing this to defend the rights of the spouse of Christ, that is the church, though such pious sophistry is ridiculous. For temporal power and greed, and lust of authority and rule, is not the spouse of Christ, nor has he wedded such a spirit, but has expressly repudiated it. Nor is this the heritage of the apostles, which they left to their true, not fictitious, successors. And so, by their striving for worldly things, the recent Roman popes do not defend her who is the spouse of Christ, that is, the multitude of the believers, but offend her. They do not preserve her beauty, that is, the unity of the faith, but defile it. They are tearing her limb from limb, and since they do not receive the true companions of Christ, poverty and humility, they show themselves not servants, but enemies of the husband. Marsilius of Padua, writing in 1324. Choosing where to begin a story is not easy. Every time we think we know where things began, there is always a wavering shadow in the distance, tempting us to climb one last hill for a clearer look at what lies beyond.
May God bless America, and may God protect our troops.
God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
God bless you, and God bless America.
Into the hands of America, God has placed the destiny of an afflicted mankind. God bless America.
For a country claiming to be founded on the principles of religious freedom and the separation of church and state, U.S. history and culture is profoundly bound up with Protestant Christianity. 35 out of 45 U.S. presidents belonged to a Protestant Christian church of one kind or another. Of the remaining 10 leaders, 4 were self-described non-Trinitarian Christians, 2 were Restorationist Christians, 2 were or are Catholic, and 1, Thomas Jefferson, usually identified himself as a non-Christian deist. And the last, Abraham Lincoln, declined to declare an adherence to any religion. It would seem only logical, then, to begin any exploration of religion in America with the birth of Protestantism. But locating the birth of Protestantism is tricky, because people have been seeking to change or redefine Christianity itself since the proto-inception of the Catholic Church during the 2nd century CE. So in order to understand what Protestants were protesting, we need to understand something about the history of the church they had come to despise. Ready? Okay, let's do this. I'm your host, Brian Halpin, and welcome to the time before we were white. Part 1. From Canaan to Crucifixion. During the 2 centuries following the death of Jesus of Nazareth, Christians were really little more than a sub-branch of Judaism, and should probably best be described as Jewish followers of the Christ cult, or perhaps Christian Jews. It is beyond the scope of this podcast to attempt even a short history of the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Books relating a history of the various peoples and conflicts in this region, called the Levant, would fill a small library. Even explaining the difference between the terms Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew could fill a book. Suffice it to say that for over 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean were populated by a patchwork of nomads, tribes, and minor kingdoms. Aramaeans, Canaanites/Phoenicians, Jebusites, Moabites, Edomites, Philistines/Sea peoples, Samaritans, Hebrews/Israelites, and Judeans, all squabbled for supremacy among themselves. When they weren't fighting among themselves, they were resisting or collaborating with Egyptian, Assyrian, Persian, Babylonian, Greek, or Roman occupiers. The concept of Jewishness as a combined religious ethnic identity didn't really become solidified until around the 5th or 6th centuries BCE in a process of self-othering. The God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, had always been closely associated and even interchangeable with other ancient war and storm gods such as Hadad or Baal. But tribal, religious, and political differences with Canaanite Phoenicians and others saw the Israelites and Judeans begin to distance their God from the ancient regional pantheon. The concepts of Satan, Beelzebub, even angels are adaptations of Bronze Age Canaanite religious traditions and the later Iron Age Babylonian pantheon of gods. The story of Noah and the flood is clearly lifted from ancient Sumerian traditions like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which the Jews would have learned about while living in Babylonian exile. Certain tribes of Hebrews began to suggest that the God known variously as Elohim or Yahweh, who had hitherto been seen as the king of the gods, was in fact the only true God. This may have been a calculated decision intended to maintain an identity clearly separate from more cosmopolitan and culturally mixed communities on the coast and to the north. Jesus was born centuries after this move to a monotheistic Judaism in a Roman province called Palestine, a region now encompassing the recently constituted state of Israel, the occupied territories of Palestine, and parts of Syria and Jordan. Palestine was ruled by the Hasmoneans at the time, Jewish client kings of Rome, who had been allowed to remain as puppet rulers after the conquest of Jerusalem by Pompey the Great in 63 BCE. The most famous of these Hasmonean kings was Herod, who undertook massive building projects during his reign and died at roughly the same time that Jesus was born. The death of Herod was a cause of upheaval, as he sought to continue his dynasty by dividing it into jurisdictions ruled by his many children. Just as in Britain during this period, the death of a puppet ruler was the excuse Rome needed to swoop in and assume even more direct control, creating a new province of Judea in Syrian Palestine. For roughly 100 years before Jesus, and the century following his death, the Levant was a bubbling cauldron of resentment and discontent among various factions of society, with elite religious castes, such as the Jewish Sadducees, trying to maintain their ancient status, while other Jewish religious groups, like the Pharisees, tried to introduce newer ideas. Both groups were careful not to antagonize Roman authorities, lest they lose their privileged positions. On the margins were religious communities like the Essenes, who probably saw the Hasmonean kings the same way the French resistance saw the government of Vichy France during World War II. But instead of openly challenging authority through demonstrations, rioting, or violence, these communities practiced a life of poverty and asceticism in remote desert places like Qumran. Jesus seems to have been born into the underclasses and taken many of his ideas from groups like the Essenes, or at least from people sympathetic to them, like the radical John the Baptist. While we should always avoid trite analogies, it would not be too far off the mark to see Jesus and his followers as being somewhat similar to any millennialist or apocalyptic sect, where a clearly charismatic man preaches the end times and a day of reckoning to come, when God would bring his final righteous vengeance down upon those responsible for all the violence, hunger, disease, corruption, injustice, and wickedness being endured by his children. The situation among the underclasses in Roman Palestine bears comparison to the atmosphere of simultaneous defiance and despair in the American West of the late 1800s, as various tribes and polities such as the Ute, Nez Perce, and Lakota fragmented under the imperial juggernaut of an expanding USA. There comes a time when it becomes clear that human agency and resistance is becoming futile, and people begin to place their hope in supernatural or higher powers. In the American West, a northern Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka preached the importance of honesty and a decent life while prophesying the end of white colonial expansion. But only if all tribes would act collectively in the performance of a ghost or spirit dance meant to call down the spirits of dead ancestors to be in unity with the living. In Roman Palestine, people far down the social scale eagerly followed and listened to the many prophets and street preachers promising the imminent return of a Messiah who, with the weight of Jehovah behind him, would sweep away the military occupiers, the tax collectors, and the upper classes collaborating with the Romans. Such rabble-rousers were always in danger of being singled out by various people interested in maintaining their positions of privilege, as seems to have been the case with John the Baptist, and of course his younger follower, Jesus of Nazareth, both of whom were executed by the Roman administration with the collaboration of Jewish elites. The underclass Jews who had followed both of these radical preachers, feeling an especially soul-destroying dismay at the execution of Jesus, began to declare that he had been the actual Messiah long promised by various prophets, and began to spread tales of miracles and of his resurrection. Those of a non-religious bent might be forgiven for seeing in Christianity the greatest spin job in human history, in which the disempowered reconfigure a loss as a victory. The arrest and execution of not one, but two charismatic preachers who had gained many followers by calling out those in power was simply too much to take. The apostles of John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth would not allow their mentors and religious leaders to simply shuffle off history's stage, just two more victims of injustice at the hands of colonialists and their enablers. No, losing would be turned into winning by claiming that the execution of Jesus had been preordained by God himself, and that as God's own Son, this Messiah had actually offered himself up as a human sacrifice. 40 years after the death of Jesus, anonymous texts began to appear, written in Greek for a non-Jewish audience, describing Jesus as a teacher, healer, and exorcist, able to perform miracles. Another generation after that, other unknown authors would begin to write edited and elaborate versions of those earliest texts, being careful to leave out or change aspects of the earlier story which might contradict or cast doubt on the realness of an emerging cult legend. Such anonymous texts would be gathered together by the later church and falsely ascribed to people who were alive during Jesus' lifetime. Part 2. From Crucifixion to Constantine. 3 or 4 generations after the death of Jesus, his followers, these Christian Jews, made their first decisive break from conventional Hellenistic Judaism and Second Temple Judaism. The last vestige of Jewish autonomy had already been broken during the First Jewish-Roman War, with the Second Temple in Jerusalem utterly destroyed in 70 CE, shortly after the execution of Jesus. And just before 132 CE, in the lead-up to the Third Jewish-Roman War, Christian Jews refused to support one last desperate uprising led by Simon Bar Kokhba, who was being touted by some rabbis, and himself, as the official coming of the Messiah. At this remove, it's hard to know whether anyone really believed this, or if it was simply a desperate ploy to drum up local support. Whatever the case, Christian Jews weren't buying it. For them, the Messiah had already arrived 100 years earlier. His tragic death had been reconfigured as a tale of self-sacrifice and miraculous resurrection, showing that the material world was no longer the center of religious life. The physical world had become a mere stepping stone to the main prize, an eternity in heaven. While Judaism under the Sadducees had shown scant interest in any clear concept of an afterlife, for Christian Jews, the afterlife would become the very focus of their new religion. Everything done in this life was merely in preparation for reaching the ultimate destination for God's people. After centuries of wars, occupations, rebellions, and enslavement, and the final crushing of the revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba, the Sadducees had disappeared, and only two Jewish religious groups were left standing: the Pharisees, who would go on to develop rabbinical Judaism, and Christian Jews, who would carry a small part of the Essene traditions with them. Countless members of both groups would disperse out of Roman Judea. Illiteracy was common among both mainstream Jews and Christian Jews at the time, but mainstream Jewish religious leaders were on the whole scholarly and literate. In the aftermath of the failed revolt by Simon Bar Kokhba's followers, Jewish leaders began to place great emphasis on literacy for all Jewish boys, not for general educational purposes, but in order to ensure that every Jewish family could study Hebrew and Aramaic religious texts. This wider community awareness of Jewish religious doctrine and folk history through literacy had long-term and probably entirely unforeseen consequences. The Jewish religion and ethnic identity would be able to survive wherever Jewish people multiplied while in possession of their holy books and texts. But this community literacy also had one huge side effect. Jews, being literate, were able to prosper and multiply in many lands outside the Levant as traders, merchants, bookkeepers, scribes, lawyers, interpreters, and agents in an age when literacy was uncommon. The religion of the radical Christian Jews was different. Christianity was spread not only through being fruitful and multiplying, but also through the fact that Christian Jews actively sought converts to their faith from outside the Jewish community through public preaching and missionary work. During its earlier years, Christianity was a sect sorely lacking in educated, literate members. Contemporary writers remarked on this lack of education and literacy among early Christian Jewish leaders, often in mocking terms. Even early luminaries of the Christian faith, such as Paul and Peter, were illiterate, dictating letters to enslaved scribes, with these letters being passed to couriers traveling the roads between cities ruled by Rome. Much of the early success in Christian proselytizing must have relied on the skill and passion of those who read such letters aloud. It would be entirely correct to say that the gospel was often spread by talented storytellers rather than religious scholars or theologians. Christian preachers of this time explicitly targeted the poorly educated underclasses, a group hugely receptive to its message and style of delivery. Christian Jews and their converts would eventually morph into the early Christian church, with a small but widespread network of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. For a podcast called Before We Were White, it is worth pointing out that for its first 300 years, Christianity was a religion of mostly brown people. Arabs, Armenians, Egyptians, Syrians, Persians, and Greeks had received the Christian message before Central and Northern Europe. It is said that the first political leader in history to convert to Christianity was Abgar the Black of Edessa in Upper Mesopotamia, a man of probable Arab ancestry. Christians were present in Ethiopia within decades of the death of Jesus, and Ethiopia declared Christianity to be its official religion as early as 330 CE. For almost 250 years after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, these mostly brown Christians would remain a minor cult among the urban poor and enslaved, widely scattered across the eastern parts of the Roman Empire and even parts of Persia and India, but rarely comprising more than around 5% of the population. The Roman citizens who continued to worship a pantheon of gods saw Jews and Christians alike as quirky, with their insistence on worshipping one single supreme god. Whereas most ancient peoples had seen their gods as being literally present among them, residing in temples and statues. The repeated destruction of Jewish temples by Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans had finally forced the Jewish people to relocate their God in the boundless ether of the heavens, out of the reach of human armies. The God of Abraham had been made omnipresent, or omni-absent, depending on one's viewpoint. Christianity, even more than Judaism, was widely viewed as a religion for fanatics, with followers behaving almost like a death cult in their eagerness to emulate the example set by their Christ. Martyrdom, or suffering and dying for one's God in the expectation of a glorious afterlife, was seen by non-Christians as downright weird. While some Christians were persecuted at specific times under certain emperors, the level of persecution and the actual reasons for it have been widely exaggerated, misunderstood, and misrepresented by later generations. Simply being a Christian was rarely treated as a crime in and of itself. When Christians were persecuted, it was usually after being denounced by their neighbors, much in the way a small community in a conservative state like Oklahoma might be up in arms if a convoy of Hare Krishnas arrived in town, constantly going door to door and chanting in public spaces, telling passers-by that they are doomed to be reincarnated as a toad due to their wickedness. And contrary to a belief held by many modern Christians, that Christians were singled out in particular for persecution, Roman leaders actually clamped down on any cult which they considered an affront to traditional patriarchal Roman culture, or any sect perceived as practicing dark magic, which might be directed at state authority. Followers of the cults of Isis and Dionysus were also sometimes harried and persecuted. Likewise, Jews, Jewish Kabbalists, and astrologers. In Roman Gaul, Druids suffered. Even teachers of rhetoric and philosophy came under scrutiny at times. All such groups could face expulsion or even death. When twitchy local communities asked the authorities to become involved, public officials were usually keen to seek a de-escalation of tensions. But during times of conflict, plague, crop failure, or similar upheaval, it wasn't uncommon for emperors to declare the need for a time of universal sacrifice to the Roman gods, seeking a show of unity which might help Rome through a difficult time. The outright refusal of Christians to get on board was seen by many as a lack of patriotism, or even a malicious undermining of the state. With many Christians actually looking forward to the end of days, in which God would overthrow all worldly kings, this religion would have seemed like borderline sedition. So it was during such times of war, unrest, trouble, or catastrophe that Christians were most likely to find themselves subject to episodes of public persecution. The Emperor Nero's state-sanctioned killing of Christians came in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, when Christians were accused of arson, possibly being scapegoated to deflect attention from whisperings that the fire might have been set by Nero himself. At any rate, things soon took a turn for the better for this small but noisy sect. The most consequential and far-reaching religious conversion in history took place in 312 CE, when the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted the Christian faith, folding it into the popular Roman Sol Invictus cult. Part 3. From Constantine to Corporation. When an empire decides to use religion as a way to unify and better control the population, then that religion needs to have clear ground rules agreed by a central authority, with those ground rules being subsequently enforced through the power of the state. Just over a decade after his conversion, Constantine summoned the Christian bishops scattered across the empire to a council in what is now present-day Turkey in the year 325 CE, in order to lay down the official tenets of Christianity. It was now nearly 300 years since the death of Jesus of Nazareth, and many versions of the Christian faith had sprouted and taken root. Some Christians were followers of the ideas spread by the converted Pharisee named Paul, who 250 years earlier had leaned heavily into the idea that Jesus had been God himself on earth in human form. Paul, for his part, had never actually met Jesus himself, but he was a man with strong feelings about things, like many humans before and since. The Gnostics and followers of Arius, along with many others, disagreed strongly with this mystical interpretation of things. But they were outvoted, and Jesus was no longer allowed to be described as simply a teacher, wise man, or prophet. He had been voted into godliness by a council of men. Or to put it more accurately, Jesus was now officially declared to be the human aspect of a god, comprised of three natures or persons. The winners at the Council of Nicaea were now armed with an official, state-sanctioned orthodoxy, and it is these Pauline bishops who would become interlocked with the Roman administrative system, acting as the voice and arbiters of acceptable religious doctrine within their civitas and dioceses. The rest is history, as they say. With the approval and power of the Roman Empire behind it, the Christian cult spread rapidly throughout much of Europe and began to rise from its former position among the poorest underclasses. And yet, in its moment of triumph, the seeds of later discord, war, and bloodshed were sown. Within another 100 years, the Christian, or Catholic Church now, had become a nascent political force, marching in virtual lockstep with those wielding secular power. Life for anyone disagreeing with official church doctrine, both Christian and non-Christian, would become very uncomfortable indeed for centuries to come. By the early 400s, some local bishops felt emboldened enough to actually pit the power of the church against any secular authorities with whom they disagreed, with religious dogma and justifications, often masking nakedly political ambitions. In Alexandria, in Egypt, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world at the time, a Christian bishop named Cyril used populist rabble-rousing to turn mobs of the more ignorant or militant type of Christian against the large Jewish population there, all to serve his own personal vendettas. Cyril was soon engaged in an out-and-out power struggle with the prefect of Alexandria, a man named Orestes, who was friends with a much admired and popular female philosopher, astronomist, mathematician, and teacher called Hypatia. The later medieval church would come to refer to all non-Christians like Hypatia as pagans, implying that such non-Christians were benighted idolaters, sorcerers, or witches, possibly in league with Satan himself. The truth is that in late antiquity, before the medieval era when the Catholic Church would become all-powerful, so-called pagans like Hypatia often belonged to schools of philosophy such as Neoplatonism, whose members sought spiritual enlightenment through knowledge and contemplation. Hypatia herself was known to be a tolerant woman, counting many Christians among her students and friends, even when many of her fellow Neoplatonists considered Christianity to be a cult of the ignorant, incompatible with philosophical inquiry. You can probably guess where this is going. Hypatia's immense popularity among both pagans and Christians, and her personal friendship with Orestes, had placed a target on her head. In the year 415 CE, mobs under a Christian reader named Peter would drag this highly accomplished elderly woman from her carriage, stripping and beating her before stoning her to death on the streets of Alexandria and tossing her naked body unceremoniously onto a bonfire. It is unclear whether Cyril personally ordered this murder, but all scholars agree that his rhetoric was largely responsible for widespread Christian mob violence. Kinder Christians and decent people everywhere were simply shocked. The church would later make Cyril a saint. Of course. The collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe just a few short decades later would create a power vacuum filled by various Germanic invaders, regional warlords, and minor kings. The only institution left with any transnational reach and cohesive administrative and political structure would be the Catholic Church, which ended up becoming de facto gatekeeper for medical care, charity, higher education, and much legal arbitration. Later critics of the Catholic Church, especially Protestants, would claim that a conspiracy existed to keep the laity or common people from reading and interpreting the Bible for themselves. While certainly not wishing to act as an apologist for the Church, this view misses a couple of important points. One, the printing press wasn't invented until the mid-1400s. All books, including the Bible, were laboriously hand-copied, usually by trained scribes working in church monasteries. With books rare and precious, and life for most people being centered on the farming calendar, the vast majority of the population were illiterate peasants. Two, anyone who did receive an education in those days, clerics, lawyers, civil servants, and physicians, usually received this education in Latin through a cathedral school, monastery, or college which was owned and run by the church. Clerics educated and trained by the church took St. Paul's clear instructions to Timothy seriously. Quote, "The things you have heard me say, entrust to reliable men, so that they may in turn teach others." Unquote. That's from 2 Timothy. So the church, of course, saw itself as these reliable men. Between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages, most of Europe had converted to Christianity, often through political maneuvering, threats, violent crusades, and coercion. The extent of church involvement in politics by the early Middle Ages can probably be best measured by the almost ridiculous number of popes who were deposed or murdered during this period. Between 872 and 965, there were at least 24 popes appointed. Between 896 and 904, there was a new pope every single year. Between 872 and 983, at least 7 popes. were murdered outright. Regional warlords, princes, and kings with serious expansionist ambitions felt compelled to turn to bishops of the church for legitimacy. After all, the aristocracy claimed that their right to rule came through divine agency. So if the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was widely believed to speak for God himself on earth, a king's power was greatly enhanced if he had God's stamp of approval. The church was only too happy to play kingmaker. Various political factions were equally willing to play pope-maker. This religious mystical anointing of royalty finds echoes to this very day. At his recent coronation ceremony, Charles III of the UK chose to be blessed with water from the very River Jordan where John the Baptist once admonished his Jewish followers to symbolically wash themselves of worldly sin in anticipation of God's imminent time of judgment. Just what a wild-eyed desert prophet in camel hair of 2 millennia ago would make of this gilded and ornate pageantry and end-stage performative feudalism is anyone's guess. At the very least, one suspects that he would be disappointed to see that the imminent judgment day he predicted had not yet come to pass. But back to the Middle Ages. The collection of tithes, the amassing of land and property, and the selling of indulgences had made the Catholic Church wealthy, powerful, and corrupt beyond measure. And more people were beginning to speak out against it. We'll continue our exploration of the roots of American religiosity in part 2 of New, Improved, and Super-Sanctified, hoping you'll be joining us then. A massive shout out and thank you to our simply wonderful patrons who make it all possible. Freya, Traveler Pony, Emmy, Beverly, Heather, Eliza, Cassie, Mike, James, Jeff, Patrick, Sarah, Paula, Sandy, John, Elizabeth, Pamela, and new patrons Jennifer and Tiffany. Additional thanks to the kind souls who threw a donation in the hat last month: Jane, Tara, Dorothy, Charles, Lizzie, and Deborah. Theme music this episode performed by Steph West on harp and Dave McLaughlin on bouzouki.